James Harris stood at the window, his hands gripping the cold metal frame. Below him, the city seemed distant, silent, unaffected by the storm that was raging inside him. He could feel the weight of his decision press against his chest, the crushing realization that his family was gone. He had kicked them out, all of them, for her. You know, it's funny how life can change in an instant, don't you? One moment you think you have everything you've ever wanted. You think the world is yours for the taking, and then out of nowhere everything crumbles. James had it all: the beautiful house, the successful career, the wife who loved him, and the kids who adored him. But what he didn't have was happiness. Or maybe it was something deeper, something he couldn't admit to himself. He was suffocating. He thought he could fix it, thought he could find a way out. And then she came into his life, Rebecca. She was everything Claire wasn't. Spontaneous, wild, carefree. She made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. So when the choice came, when it became clear that it was either his family or her, he didn't hesitate. He chose Rebecca. But here's the thing you need to understand. James never saw the cost of that decision. He never imagined that the woman he thought would save him would be the one to destroy him. And when his wife, Claire, found out about the affair, she didn't just walk away. No, she fought. She fought for their family. But James, blinded by his own desires, pushed her out. He threw his family out like they were nothing. You know what hurts the most, though? What really cuts deep? It wasn't that he lost his family. It wasn't even the shame of what he'd done. No, it was the silence. The silence from the people who should have cared the most. His own mother, who had always been there for him, the one person he thought he could count on, was silent. But James didn't know yet. He didn't know that she wasn't just staying quiet. She was planning to testify against him. And when that moment came, when his mother spoke those words that no son ever wants to hear, he would realize the depth of his betrayal. But it would be too late. The damage would be done. The door slammed behind him, echoing through the quiet hallway. James stood frozen for a moment, his chest heaving with the anger and frustration that had built up over the years. He had finally gotten what he wanted, freedom. But it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like a prison. It wasn't long before the weight of his choices began to settle on him. There was Rebecca, sure, but she wasn't the answer to everything. In fact, she was the beginning of the end. Rebecca was no savior. She was a manipulator, someone who knew how to get under his skin, how to make him believe she was the one who could fill the void. But the more he spent time with her, the more he realized something wasn't right. She was using him, playing him just like he had played Claire. But you know what James didn't expect? What he never saw coming? A man named Ethan Ward. Ethan was a billionaire, a self-made one, and he had history with James, a history of betrayal. You see, Ethan and James shared a past, one that James had conveniently forgotten. Ethan had been a partner, a mentor, a friend, until James betrayed him for personal gain. When Ethan showed up at James' doorstep, it wasn't a gesture of kindness. No, it was an ultimatum. He wasn't there to save James. He was there to make sure the mistakes James had made didn't destroy him completely. Ethan had his own agenda, one that tied back to the very thing James had lost, his empire. And Ethan wasn't about to let that slip away. As Ethan extended his hand, offering James resources, lawyers, investigators, the means to protect himself, James hesitated. He didn't want to owe anyone anything, especially not Ethan. But when it came down to it, Ethan's help was the only chance he had left to save whatever was left of his life. "You'll need to accept the help, James," Ethan had said, his voice firm but not unkind. "For your daughter's sake, if not for your own." And that's when it hit him, the weight of his daughter's future. He had done everything for success, for his family, and now he was willing to let it all slip away. But if he didn't take this opportunity, he'd lose it all. Again. James sat in his office, the papers in front of him, the weight of their contents bearing down on him. He had always been good at business, numbers, deals, connections. But this was different. This was personal. You see, betrayal doesn't just hurt, it eats you alive from the inside. Rebecca wasn't just after his money, after his wealth. No, she was after control. She wanted everything he had, but she also wanted to tear him down piece by piece until there was nothing left. She didn't care about the family, the life, or the promises he'd made. She cared about power, about what she could take from him. James learned that the hard way when he started digging deeper into her finances. Rebecca had been siphoning money from their accounts, draining resources, playing a game that James couldn't even begin to understand. And the more he uncovered, the more he realized how deep the betrayal ran. She had planned this for months, maybe even years. But that wasn't all. What really hit him, what really broke him, was the insurance policy. The life insurance policy that Rebecca had manipulated him into signing. It wasn't just about him, though, it was about the baby. And that's when James understood the full scope of the betrayal. Rebecca wasn't just after his fortune. She was after something much darker. The policy was clear: double payout for pregnancy loss. A brutal, calculated move, but one that James had missed until it was too late. But here's the kicker. While James was grappling with the depth of his mistakes, his mother, his own mother, had already made her move. She had been sitting on the sidelines, watching as her son spiraled. And when the time came, she wasn't going to let him off the hook. She wasn't going to sit quietly and watch as he destroyed everything they had built. His mother's testimony wasn't just a betrayal. It was the final nail in his coffin. But there was more to this story than he realized. James stood in his office, the weight of the world on his shoulders. His phone buzzed, an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. When he heard Ethan's voice, it felt like a cold reminder of everything he had lost. "I'm here to help, James, but you need to accept it. We're not just talking about your company anymore. This is about everything, your future, your daughter's future." Ethan's words cut through the fog of confusion that had clouded James's mind. He had always been a proud man, too proud to accept help from anyone, least of all the man he'd wronged years ago. But the situation was dire, and it seemed like Ethan was the only one who could help him now. As Ethan detailed his resources, lawyers, investigators, a way out, James knew this wasn't just about saving his company or his wealth. This was about saving his daughter's future, ensuring she wouldn't grow up in a broken world of his making. For the first time in months, James allowed himself to hope, but it wasn't easy. Pride had always been his shield, and now it was his greatest enemy. Ethan had crossed boundaries once, betrayed him in business, but now it felt like Ethan was giving him a lifeline, and James had no choice but to grab it. "You'll be fine, James," Ethan's voice softened. "It's your family I'm worried about. We can fix this, but only if you do it right." The words stung. James didn't know what doing it right looked like anymore. His life had become a series of mistakes, and now he was staring down the abyss of what could be his last chance at redemption. The files were endless. Bank records, texts, emails. It was all there, laid out in front of him like a jigsaw puzzle he had no idea how to solve. James felt sick as he scrolled through the documents, each one revealing another layer of betrayal. Rebecca had carefully orchestrated every part of the plan. She had drained accounts, forged signatures, manipulated situations, all to secure the payout from the life insurance policy. But what James hadn't realized was that the betrayal went even deeper than that. She had been in contact with someone else, someone who had been pulling the strings all along. The more James discovered, the more he realized how little he knew about the woman he had trusted. Rebecca wasn't just a mistress, and she wasn't just a woman seeking his fortune. No, she was a part of something bigger, a conspiracy, a scheme that had been going on for years. But the most shocking discovery came when James stumbled upon a familiar name in one of the emails. His business rival, Mark, had been working with Rebecca, and Mark wasn't just trying to take over James's business. No, he had bigger plans, plans that involved taking everything James had worked for, including his family. The betrayal was deeper than he could have ever imagined, and as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, James realized that the only way to stop this was to expose Mark and Rebecca for who they truly were. James knew he had to act fast, but with Rebecca's web of lies and manipulation closing in on him, he wondered if he was too late. James leaned against the wall, his hands trembling as he stared at the photograph in front of him. It was old, grainy, but unmistakable. It was a picture of Rebecca, and standing next to her was none other than Ethan. The room spun. The billionaire had been a part of this all along. How could he have missed it? Ethan had been manipulating him from the beginning. The resources he had offered James, the lawyers, the investigators, had all been part of the plan to keep him under control. But here's the thing. James didn't know the full story. Ethan had been playing a game, but not the game James thought. There was a personal vendetta between Ethan and Rebecca, a vendetta that went back years, one that was far more complicated than just business. It was about revenge, about betrayal, about love lost and never regained. As James tried to process the revelation, another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Ethan wasn't just offering help. He was offering it with strings attached. James had become a pawn in a game he hadn't even known was being played. And just when James thought he couldn't be more betrayed, Ethan showed up at his door. "I wasn't playing you, James," he said, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. "I was playing her." Ethan's words hung in the air, and for a moment, James wasn't sure if he could trust him, or if Ethan was just another part of the web that was closing in around him. James stood across from Rebecca in the courtroom, his heart pounding in his chest. She had been ruthless, cunning, and manipulative, but this was it. This was his moment to take back everything she had stolen from him. As the case went on, James realized that this wasn't just about proving Rebecca's guilt. No, this was about proving to himself that he was the man he used to be, the man who had thrown everything away for selfish desires. This was about redemption. And then in the middle of the trial, Rebecca did the one thing he hadn't expected. She confessed. "I did it for the money," she said, her voice cold, almost detached. "You never mattered to me, James. You were just a means to an end." The courtroom fell silent. James could feel the weight of the words in his chest, but the relief that followed was overwhelming. Rebecca had revealed herself. She had finally shown the world who she truly was. But even as she confessed, James knew there was still one more thing to settle, one more battle to fight. James knew that the final showdown was coming, and that the truth about Ethan's involvement still needed to be exposed. But first, he had to face his own past. The courtroom was silent, the tension thick in the air. James stood tall, his face stoic, his heart racing. For years, he had lived in fear, fear of losing everything, fear of facing the consequences of his actions. But now, as he listened to the judge pronounce the verdict, it felt like a weight was being lifted off his shoulders. "Guilty," the judge said, the word echoing through the room. "Rebecca Harris, you are hereby sentenced to 20 years in prison for conspiracy, fraud, and the premeditated destruction of a family." It was over. The trial that had consumed his life for months, the court battles that had torn him apart emotionally and financially. Finally, it was all over, and the person who had betrayed him most was going to pay the price. But even as the verdict was read, James felt no joy. He didn't feel victorious. No, what he felt was relief, and that relief was bittersweet. He looked over at Rebecca, her eyes filled with anger and defiance. She was a woman who had played him, used him, and in the end destroyed his life. But in that moment, James realized that her punishment wasn't for him. It was for his daughter. It was for his chance at redemption, for his future. "You won," Ethan said, standing beside him. "But this isn't over. It never is." James nodded. There was still much to rebuild, and he knew that this victory was just the beginning of the long road to healing. As the gavel fell, James felt the weight of the final decision. But there was one thing that still haunted him. Rebecca wasn't the only one who had betrayed him. There was still someone else out there. It had been months since the trial, and things had finally started to settle. James had spent the time rebuilding his life, focusing on what truly mattered: his daughter, his family, and the man he had become. He'd lost everything: his wealth, his status, his reputation. But in the end, he had gained something far more important. His daughter Lily was growing up, and for the first time, James could see the hope in her eyes. The future was uncertain, but it was brighter now that he had the chance to be the father she deserved. And then there was Ethan. The billionaire who had once been his enemy was now his ally. They had come to an understanding, a mutual respect that had grown through the chaos and pain they'd both endured. It wasn't a friendship, but it was something deeper, a bond forged in the fire of betrayal. But even as James began to feel the first stirrings of peace, there was still a lingering thought at the back of his mind. The guilt, the regrets, the choices he had made, the mistakes he couldn't undo. "You've made it through the worst of it," Ethan had told him one evening, his voice quiet but firm. "But now it's time to live for the future, not the past." And so James did. He moved forward, step by step, with the knowledge that he was no longer the man he once was. But as James began to find peace, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he was missing. Something about Rebecca's final words that he couldn't ignore. Chapter 10, the epilogue, the life that was built. It had been 5 years since the trial, and James was no longer the broken man who had walked into that courtroom. He had rebuilt his life, piece by piece, and now, as he looked out over the city from his office, he saw something he hadn't seen before: a future. A real future. His company was thriving again, though this time it was built on honesty, on hard work, and on the lessons he had learned the hard way. He had started over, not just professionally, but personally. His relationship with Lily had grown stronger, and he was proud to see her growing into the woman he had always hoped she would be. But there was still a part of James that couldn't forget the past. It would always be there, a shadow that followed him, reminding him of what he had lost and what he had gained. But instead of letting it weigh him down, James had learned to accept it. He had learned that the past didn't define him. It was the choices he made today, the person he became in the aftermath, that mattered. And then, as he stood by the window, watching the sun set over the skyline, he received a message that would change everything. It was from Ethan. "I found something," the message read. "Something that belongs to you. He tried to destroy me. Instead, he gave me the chance to build something real."